William Faulkner's short story, Carcassonne, 1931, is a curious and enigmatic work that Faulkner himself seems to have valued highly. He placed it as the concluding story in his Collected Stories of 1950, as though it summed up the meaning of the volume. Carcassonne has, however, puzzled a majority of readers, and one Faulkner specialist has even called it, quote, all but unreadable. The story is about a poet and tramp who lives in a rat-infested garret in the port of Rincon in Mexico. He sleeps under tarred sheeting, which he rolls up in the morning and stacks up in the corner. Every night, the man dreams of mounting a horse and galloping up the clouds towards a pinnacle in the sky. The story begins with the tramp poet's own inner speech, an inner speech that appears periodically in the otherwise third-person narration of the story and that is marked by italics. And me on a buckskin pony with eyes like blue electricity and a mane like tangled fire, galloping up the hill and right into the high heaven of the world. The dreamer also imagines that he is a Norman knight, like Godfrey of Boulogne in the First Crusade, leading his horse into battle, quote, against the Saracen emir, thundering on through the assembled foes of our meek lord, end of quote. The emir has cut the horse in two, but the determined horse doesn't know it is dead and keeps riding. These medieval associations give the story its title Carcassonne, after a crusader citadel in the south of France. Another component of the story is the inner dialogue that the writer has with his own skeleton, who reminds him of his mortality and the final wisdom of, quote, lying still. The story has a formal feature that stands out. It is a narrative in which nothing happens. The horse gallops, quote, without progression, and the, quote, blue precipice is, quote, never gained. I will return later to this temporal or lyrical stasis and try to interpret it within a broader historical context. The story's evident importance for Faulkner perhaps lies in its being a secret autobiography. It is a self-portrait of the author as a bohemian and failed poet, like the man in the attic. This self-portrait of the failed poet is drawn trenchantly in Faulkner's comments on the story during his recordings for the University of Virginia in the 1950s. Let's just play an audio clip of Faulkner's actual words when he was asked about Carcassonne.
I was still writing about a young man in conflict with his environment. It seemed to me that fantasy was the best way to tell that story. To have told it in terms of simple realism would have lost something, in my opinion. To use fantasy was the best, and that's a piece that I've always liked, because there was the poet again. I wanted to be a poet, and I think of myself now as a failed poet, not as a novelist, but a failed poet who had to take up what he could do.
The story is also secret autobiography because it is a portrait of Faulkner as a would-be fighter pilot in the First World War. At the age of 20, Faulkner joined the RAF in Toronto in July 1918. Pretending to be an Englishman. But he never qualified as a pilot. In fact, he never even had any flight training because the war ended before he had finished ground instruction. Quote, they stopped the war on him, end of quote, Faulkner says of a disappointed pilot cadet in the same predicament in an early novel, Soldier's Pay. Faulkner's non-qualification as a pilot didn't prevent him from parading in an RAF lieutenant's uniform with a wings badge when he got back to his home in Oxford, Mississippi, and even from claiming that he'd flown in action on the front. These two autobiographies of failure as poet and as pilot create a style in Carcassonne of compensatory fantasy, as Faulkner called it. It is a style that strains toward a literary absolute, to infinitize the infinite, to infinitize the finite. The poet's sky has predecessors in romantic and symbolist poetry, such as Stephen Mallarmé's The Azure. Faulkner's studied surrealistic words match those of such a predecessor. The horse, for example, has, quote, a mane like tangled fire, and it gallops up, quote, a piled silver hill of cumuli. Faulkner associated this flight toward a poetic absolute as a legacy of late 19th century Southern Romanticism. He once claimed, quote, I am inclined to think it was because of the bareness of the Southerner's life that he had to resort to his own imagination, to create his own Carcassonne, end of quote. The penchant of this bare Southern imagination of the late 19th century for medieval and Arthurian fantasy reflects the chevalier ideals of the white planter class and their continuation in the neo-Confederate writings of the Lost Cause. One example of this regional mythology of the chevalier is at the very end of Faulkner's first Yokler Patafar novel, Flags in the Dust, 1927. The narrator says of the name of the Sartoris family, one of the last plantation families in 1919, quote, for there is death in the sound of it, means the name of the Sartoris family, and glamorous fatality, like silver pennons down rushing at sunset, or a dying fall of horns along the road to Roncevaux. That is the Battle of 1778, in which Roland, the first knight of medieval chivalry, was killed while blowing a horn. This description of the Sartoris family might make it seem that Faulkner himself was succumbing to its, quote, glamorous fatality. But the framing of the description is ironic. Faulkner calls the Sartoris code an, quote, old dead pattern. In fact, Flags in the Dust is much more concerned with the First World War in the South than it is with the Civil War, a claim I would extend to nearly all of Faulkner's work. In Flags in the Dust, Bayard Sartoris, the heir of the Sartoris planter family, becomes a pilot on the Western Front. Although he is named after a famous French knight, Bayard is quite an iconoclast about Southern pieties. He has an argument with his Aunt Jenny in which he defames the Civil War as a, quote, little two-bit war. Quote, anyone, he says, can go to war on a horse. No chance for him to do anything much. But Bayard, for all his vaunting of the air as a new element of war, cannot control this element and its compression of huge distances at speed, what the French theorist Paul Virilio calls dromology. Bayard loses his twin brother Johnny in air combat, and when he returns to Mississippi agrarian life, he becomes addicted to driving a fast car. His addiction to speed finally kills him when he pilots a ramshackle experimental aircraft whose wings fall off. Faulkner presents a number of these traumatized pilots in his fiction of the 1920s and early 1930s, such as Soldier's Pay and Ad Astra. And perhaps the poet-pilot of Carcassonne can be seen as one such veteran. This is a portrait by the German expressionist painter of a war veteran, Max John, in 1920. And I think it can be argued that Faulkner is part of a transatlantic attempt to find art forms appropriate to the expression of war trauma. So Dix and Faulkner are colleagues in this attempt to find an aesthetics of war trauma. In Carcassonne, the poet-pilot's mind is full of the new military element of the air, but he inherits enough of a lush, late Southern Romanticism to try to turn this new element into a land war of horses and crusaders. But this Romanticism already carries the wound of modernity, just as the poet-pilot rides a horse that is cut in half and already dead. There are already stylistic deposits of the commodification of the market in the turn of the poet's language from myth to reified word object. This is apparent in such expressions as the, quote, blue electricity of the horse's eyes. Faulkner also annexes an ironic commentary to the poet-pilot's dream by locating him in the debased environment of the modern post-1918 economy. The poet lives in the attic of a building owned by Standard Oil and looks out from this viewpoint over the smeared lights of the oil port of Rincon. Mrs. Widdrington, a company wife, is a patron of the poet, and as in a literary market that is rapidly being infiltrated by the 1930s culture industry, she has symbolic proprietorship of the poet's words. It is not only air, but also water that dominates the poet-pilot's imagination. He has Prufrock-like dreams of drifting in, quote, the caverns of the sea, and of his bones knocking together in the current. This material poetics of the elements of water and air can be translated into geopolitical terms. It could be argued that it was the First World War that profoundly altered what the plantation South was, particularly its conception of space. The ocean, as the Atlantic passageway to Europe, becomes of vital importance, pulling the South into the global space of world war. Water is the new borderless global element that thoroughly reorganizes the borders of the South. And the air was an even more recent borderless element in 1918 that was fully to come into its own in the Second World War. These two elements of air and water are in direct opposition to the earth. The conservative element, which above all identifies the regional specialness of the Old South as a white landed gentry, as a white landed legacy, and as a legacy marked by graveyard and plantation. This is why the conclusion of Flags in the Dust, which is set in Jefferson Graveyard, is significant as a statement of the spatial transformation of the South. In this conclusion, Aunt Jenny visits the graveyard, which is a sacred site of the old plantocracy. She notes how the site is overseen by the statue of Bayard's great-grandfather, the Confederate Colonel John Sartoris, whose head is lifted in a quote, gesture of haughty pride. But in the middle of this graveyard is the empty tomb of Bayard's twin brother, the pilot Johnny, whose body lies in an unknown grave across the Atlantic in Flanders. The poet-pilot of Carcassonne is also a displaced Southerner within the international framework of the post-World War I settlement. He comes under the protection of the Standard Oil Company, the leading company in the sea-based economic empire of the US that has now reached Mexico and the Caribbean. The new politics of the dimensions of air and water is examined in a work of the legal thinker Carl Schmitt, Land and Sea, from 1942. Schmidt has, to say the least, an ambivalent reputation today because he was a supporter of the Third Reich, but his thought proves to be stimulating when considering the change in spatial symbolism marked by the War of 1914 to 1918. Schmidt explains this war by positing a fundamental antinomy between the elements of land and water. The spatial order of 19th century Europe was land-based, resulting from a primordial naming or nomos that divided up and distributed the earth. Up until 1914, this spatial order provided a stable continental regime that was governed by Roman law and by just limited wars. But by the late Victorian period, this regime was under threat. It was undermined by the newer spatial order of the world, which was based on the naval power of England and the United States. For Schmidt, there is something lawless about water and air. Both are anarchic elements of the non-nomos. Through the First World War, the Anglo-American maritime nations had breached the 19th century European ordo and introduced a new kind of universalistic inhuman war. The poet pilot of Carcassonne belongs unwittingly to this new spatial order. On the level of the material imagination, he allows his mind to be filled up with the impersonal elements of air and water. He imagines, for example, that his lost bones will drift over the seabed. Like Johnny Sartoris, he will die without benefit of burial, without the blessings of the humus of earth or its etymological derivative, the human. Further, the dense web of illusions in Carcassonne relate to the rupture caused by this revolutionary spatial order in 1918. The break in the legacy of legitimism and traditionalism in the story explains its reliance on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and its images of rats' feet, bones under the water, and fallen sovereigns. Eliot's poem puts into uniquely evocative images the new geopolitics of the post-World War I world. The fixed borders of 19th century Europe have been broken. The earth has lost its nomos, its principle of inner limit. Quotation. Who are those hooded hordes, swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? Land has lost its power to organize, and the people that live within these, quote, endless plains are now amorphous collections of humanity, quote, hooded hordes. Eliot puts these broken borders of Europe into continuity with what he sees as the destructive elements of sea and air. There is Phlebas, the drowned Phoenician, whose bones are picked in whispers, and there are world cities that are suspended in and crack, quote, in the violet air. Together with the old borders, the old successive principle of monarchy has also vanished. Quote, only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. The poet pilot of Carcassonne, insofar as he is a southern and Eliotic traditionalist, also regrets the fall of kings and the end of the legitimist legacy of old Europe. There is a passage in Carcassonne where this break in legacy is pointedly referred to through the murder of two kings. It is when the poet pilot hears the rats scuttling around him in the dark of the garret. A fairy pattering of little feet behind a bloody arras, where fell. So that part of the quotation is a reference to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Where fell, where I was king of kings, but the woman with the dog's eyes to knock my bones together and together. That's a reference to Homer's Odyssey. In this extract, the poet Pilate compares himself to Prince Hamlet, whose royal father has been poisoned and who kills the spying Polonius, a rat, behind the bloody arras. Quote, the time is out of joint for Hamlet, a figure being revived in such post-World War I texts as Paul Valéry's The Crisis of Mind, as the symbolic inheritor of broken Europe. And it is also out of joint for the poet Pilate. Then the poet Pilate compares himself to Agamemnon, the king of kings, who returns from war in Homer's The Odyssey to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra. Quote, the woman with the dog's eyes in Faulkner's favorite translation. It is now time to return to the question left hanging from the beginning of the presentation, that Carcassonne is a story without a plot, without progression. When viewed from the perspective of the earth and its nomos, the new element of air has no measurable dimension. The narrator says, for example, that the rider rides in the Holy Land amid, quote, hopeless horizons filled with shimmering nothingness. And these hopeless horizons seem to recall the, quote, ringed by the flat horizon only of the wasteland. Faulkner is uncertain about this new global space of the air and its pure extension. At the end of the story, he leaves the, quote, destinationless steed and rider to, quote, thunder on, thunder punily diminishing. One can see this southern telluric anxiety taken up in Alan Tate's poem, Ode to Our Young Proconsuls of the Air, 1943, an ode that attacks American strategic bombing in the Second World War as an unjust and global extension of war. For all the poets striving upward, he is still tied, as the last line of the story states, to, quote, the dark and tragic figure of the earth, his mother, end of quote. These last words suggest that the poet Pilate cannot forget this great mother, the original element of Schmidt's nomos, nor can he forget the burdened, quote, tragic language of the earth. He says, quote, I want to perform something bold and tragical and austere. His skeletons, whose words carp on his mortality, also acts as a reminder of the earth as home. In conclusion, Carcassonne expresses the contradictions of Faulkner's literary mission, including the contradictions of his historical position as a post-World War I Southerner. Faulkner's imagination has been suddenly pushed out of the earth thinking and the earth poetry of the region into the new globalized air and sea domain created by the First World War. But it still tries to hang on to, quote, the tragic figure of the earth, his mother, the source of the autochthonous dark doom in Faulkner's writing that is inherent in living upon a land created through plantation slavery. Thank you.